Well, thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be speaking to all of you. Thank you to all the partners and Hedayah who put this together. And of course, to the government of the Netherlands for inviting me. So as Bibi so kindly mentioned and introduced me, I am the founder and CEO of Mythos Labs. We are a social enterprise that uses media and technology to combat online harms, including violent extremism, disinformation, and online misogyny. So today, and if we could go to the next slide, please, I'm here to talk to you about SMILE, which is an initiative we put together called the Social Media and Internet Literacy e-Module. SMILE is an edutainment-based approach or a humor-based approach to trying to prevent online harms and build people's resilience to online harms. What SMILE is basically a free, accessible to the general public e-module that anybody can take at www.smilemodule.com. It takes about 30 to 45 minutes to complete. And it teaches internet users key concepts related to defending against misinformation, extremist propaganda, and hate speech and threats to their digital privacy. But it teaches them this not through PowerPoints or through presentations. It teaches them this through comedy and through the use of humor. Specifically, can get into the format a bit on the next slide, please. And before that, just to let you know that the target audience that we had in mind when we created SMILE, and mind you, this was a pilot initiative. What we were trying to figure out is, can humor actually be effective in increasing people's media literacy and specifically making them more resilient to extremist content, more able to identify, report, and defend against extremist propaganda online. So the country where we piloted this was India, home to one of the largest internet using populations in the world, and also one of the largest populations of youth in the world. The target audience, the target age range that we were looking at for this intervention was audiences between 13 to 18 years of age. Now, 13, as many of you know, is the earliest age that someone can officially or legally start using social media platforms like Instagram and YouTube. I think we all know that probably there are people much younger than that using these platforms, but we wanted to target folks who are just sort of coming onto these platforms, relatively new, and limit it to students who are still absorbing knowledge, who are still learning about information integrity, and that is the cohort that we were targeting. One of the reasons we also targeted this group is that they are the most likely to share content relevant to their interests, regardless of its credibility. And that's based on several recent studies published in the last 5 years, especially during the pandemic. We saw higher rates of content sharing across platforms, driven largely by young audiences that were the quickest to share and perhaps the least skeptical of some of the information that they were sharing. So on the next slide, please. I can walk you through a little bit about what the format of SMILE is. So SMILE, if you go to it, you'll see a welcome page, and then you basically see a series of comedic videos. And in each video, we partnered with a very, very popular local comedian, a woman named Saloni Gore, who is an influencer, comedian, actor, TV show star, movie star, and she is known in India for her quirky, sort of irreverent sense of humor. She's young herself, she's a Gen Zer, and so she's got a strong appeal among Gen Z and even Gen Alpha, but also millennials. It kind of spans the age 13 to 35 demographic. What we have in SMILE is that you see a video of Saloni explaining a key concept related to misinformation or extremist propaganda. For example, maybe explaining how extremists use different manipulation techniques to confuse and mislead audiences online. And then it's a 5 to 7 minute video. And then after that video, you are asked to fill out a couple of multiple choice questions. Not too many, just 2 or 3. If you get the answer right, you get a little sticker and congratulations. If you get it wrong, you get an explanation for why it was wrong. And the questions test your understanding of how well you retained the knowledge that was disseminated in the comedic video that you just saw. And then you move on to the next video about the next topic, and so on and so forth. And like that, there are 7 what we call edutaining videos, videos that are both educational and informative, but also entertaining, and 23 multiple choice questions. And then I'm going to come to this later at the end of my presentation as well, but very important, the certificate. We give you a certificate if you want. At the end of completion, all you have to do is enter your email address and it's digitally mailed to you. And we found that to be a very powerful incentive. And I'll talk more about that in the lessons learned later on. So on the next slide, please. What was the whole impact of this, right? What did it actually lead to? Well, the good news is that Smile did lead to major increases in people's ability to identify and report extremist propaganda. Now, Smile's been taken by tens of thousands of young people across India, across income groups, across geographies. And what we saw is that people's ability to identify common manipulation techniques used to spread extremist propaganda. I'm talking about techniques like decontextualizing or spoofing or scapegoating, us versus them, in-group, out-group, those sorts of things. Their ability to recognize those techniques increased by almost, over 3x. And perhaps equally importantly, their ability to report extremist propaganda on at least 3 popular social platforms, whether it's Facebook or YouTube or TikTok or Snapchat, also increased by nearly 3-fold. So when I say report, I mean what we found in some of our, and by the way, this data was gathered through pre and post surveys. Users were asked to fill out a survey before taking Smile and after taking Smile, which tested how well they could do these tasks, such as identify extremist techniques and report extremist content. And what we were really interested to see is we designed the experiment or the intervention to try and teach people how to identify extremist propaganda. But what we saw in the pre-surveys was that there were really low levels of media literacy among youth when it comes to reporting extremist propaganda. People didn't know, some people knew how to recognize it, but they didn't know what to do if they recognized it. They didn't know that Facebook or even WhatsApp and Twitter have specific mechanisms that any user can use to categorize content as extremist propaganda. Now, this is probably very obvious to all of you in the room because you're very distinguished researchers and practitioners and experts in PCVE, but to a very even well-educated and informed person who is in high school, that may not be the case. They weren't really aware that platforms had these mechanisms in place. So teaching them how to report this kind of content, which Smile does through step-by-step tutorials, is extremely important because that's how we'll actually start to see some impact and develop a more accurate picture of online harms. On to the next slide, please. We also got extremely positive feedback on this approach. We were a little nervous about using comedy. Comedy, of course, can be very subjective. What one person finds funny, another person cannot. Well, Mythos Labs, you know, as we mentioned, we've got a bit of a background in comedy. I personally used to write for The Onion, which is a satirical publication in the US, and we had a TV show as well. But a lot of our team come from backgrounds in entertainment as well. So we tried to sort of use a type of humor that would be thought-provoking but not offensive, that would be insightful but not controversial. And that's a difficult balance to hit, I'll admit. And so you have to be really, really careful when choosing the right comedian to work with and the right tonality. And I'll talk more about that in lessons learned. But as you can see from this slide, students and young people who took this, and not just young people, by the way, of the 25,000 plus first 25,000 users who took Smile that we administered this survey to, many just happened to be middle-aged or the parents of students who had brought it home as homework and things like that. And they had similar reactions. They really liked the humor. So the other key learning for us was that, oh, humor, and perhaps this sounds obvious now, but now we've got the data to prove it, that it's not just young people who are hungry for entertaining content. All of us, even if we wear suits and ties, we like to laugh. And we like to laugh while we're learning. So that was a great and reassuring thing to see. On the next slide, please. We saw, more sort of positive comments from users saying that they really liked the way that this content was delivered. We got some positive traction in the press as well. And people really saying, this is the kind of content they wanted to see. There was another thing we were unsure of, is that, will this come off as too preachy? Are we forcing this? Are we giving audiences a choice? But it turns out people were proactively seeking out this kind of content. And on to the next slide, please. The results of this were that Smile was incorporated into 35 schools across India. It was endorsed by UNESCO. The schools were a mix of rural, urban, metropolitan areas. We didn't see any statistical difference in terms of people's response, depending on which type of environment they lived in, whether it was rural or urban. The reaction to Smile was more or less consistent. And of course, most teachers who assigned Smile as homework in these schools said that it received really, really high levels of student engagement, as in 100% or thereabouts completion rates for homework assignments. And for those of us who have ever been to school in our lives, we know that that's very impressive for a class to have a 100% completion rate on any homework assignment. On to the next slide, please. So the next steps for Smile are to sort of expand this to other countries. We are actively working in Sri Lanka and in Canada to get local versions of Smile Canada, Smile Sri Lanka up and running. I wanted to just take a second to, this is not on the slides, but just the remaining 2 minutes that I have, talk about the lessons that we learned from this. There's about 4 key lessons that I think we could share with the community. Number one, and I know this is going to sound trivial, but certification of young people is a very powerful incentive. We were surprised to see that 98% of people opted to receive a digital certificate, and 94% of the people who completed Smile proactively, without any encouragement from us, uploaded their certificate of completing Smile onto their social media, their LinkedIn, their Twitter, their Facebook. And I think that's probably because academic admissions into universities and graduate schools have become so competitive that students are desperate for ways to differentiate themselves. So even though they didn't even necessarily know what Mythos Labs is or what Smile is, they were just like, well, it's a certificate, I want it. And so it was a really powerful incentive, which worked well for us. Number two, when it came to disseminating this campaign, we had a limited budget. So what we used was micro-influencers. We hired 9 different micro-influencers, that's social influencers with a following of 0 to 50,000. And we asked them to create reels, 30-second Instagram reels or YouTube shorts, where they would advertise Smile to their audience in a way that appealed to their niche audience. So for example, one micro-influencer, she's a legal influencer. She talks about all things legal policy in India. She said, hey, have you ever thought about the legal implications of extremist propaganda, or what is the legal action you can take if you're the victim of abuse online, etc., etc. If you want to know more about this, check out Smile Module. It's a cool new initiative, etc. And someone who talks about sports weaved this into their sports narrative, etc., etc. That method proved really effective, even though we had just a small budget to spend on this. By hiring 9 micro-influencers, we were able to make Smile India, the hashtag, the #1 trending hashtag in India for 24 hours. And India's got, over 1 billion people, so that's a pretty big deal. The third learning that I'd like to share is that among the 13 to 18 target demographic that we built this program for, 13 to 15 responded significantly better to it. They had higher retention rates, they had higher satisfaction rates than 15 to 18. As mentioned, it was positive overall, but we found the strongest fit to be with middle schoolers, with people who are just coming online or have been online for just a couple of years. This approach seemed to work best with them. And lastly, the sort of question of whether or not humor can be effective, it all comes down to choosing the right style of comedian and the right style of comedy. There's a quote that I'll leave you with, which those who've met me have probably heard before, including some of our esteemed panelists who have had the pleasure of working with before. And it's a quote we live by at Mythos Labs, which George Bernard Shaw said. Oscar Wilde also is attributed to this quote, depending on who you're a fan of. But they said, if you want to tell people the truth, make them laugh. Otherwise, they'll kill you. And with that, I look forward to your questions. Thank you so much.